Alright, so folks, in this video we will learn how to use some basic Eclipse abilities to set up your workspace to debug your application running on JBOSS without any plugin, right? So, we all prefer using all kinds of productivity tools with Eclipse to make sure that we can do our work at the fastest pace possible, most efficiently. But in some big organizations that are, especially risk averse, external downloads like plugins, Eclipse Marketplace is not available, right? So in those cases, we do not have the ability to download plugins to make our lives easier and debug our applications using those plugins inside Eclipse. And this video is really tailored towards that audience. You have a situation where you cannot use a JBoss plugin, you still want to debug your application. How will you do it using Eclipse and JBoss without any special tools, right? This is what this video is about, right? Um, just a quick note, this video is not for newbies, right? So if you're looking for basic information on JBoss, on Eclipse, this video is not for you guys. You should not use your time watching this video, right? This video is catered more towards a mid-level audience who have spent some time using JBoss, have a decent understanding of Eclipse, and know their way around developing a Java web application using these two environments of Eclipse, deploying it to JBoss, all that stuff, right? So this video is really catered towards that audience. Newbies may not find this information very helpful because they are really looking at a more basic level of information, which this video does not offer. All right. So with that said, let's jump in, right? So like I said, you have a situation where you are trying to debug an application that is to be deployed on JBoss using your local workspace, and you don't have access to any plugins, right? How do you do that? So what we will do is we will use some inbuilt Java abilities to do this debugging setup using what's called as the remote socket debugging or JPDA, right? So the first step that we will do is we'll essentially enable JPDA for remote socket debugging in standalone.conf under JBoss home bin, right? So if you go to JBoss home, under JBoss home bin, you will see this standalone.conf. It is essentially a very standard file. It's there in every JBoss installation. It's a file that has all of your startup settings, JVM arguments, and so on, right? And one of those arguments is what we will tweak. Let me show you which one. Okay, so if you go over here, this is my standalone.conf, and over here, if you just do a search for JPDA, you will find this line over here, right? You will find two of these lines: sample JPDA setting for remote socket debug and sample JPDA for shared memory debug. In this video, we will talk about socket debug. That is the most standard way of doing your debugging. There are some advantages also that I'll briefly touch upon towards the end, right? So when you will enter this file, most likely you will see that this line is there, but it is commented out. So just remove this comment, save it, and essentially at that point you can try starting your JBoss, and I'll show you what to look for when you start it, right? So let's just complete this. So once you're done with changing, what you should definitely do is make sure that your setting has taken effect by starting up your JBOSS using your bat file or sh file as your environment. Maybe in my case I'm using Ubuntu, so it's standalone.sh, right? So if I click on this, if I start this, essentially JBoss will start up, right? So the thing to look for to make sure that your JPDA setting is indeed enabled is this line. So if you noticed in our standalone.conf, we actually enabled JPDA, right? And as part of doing that, we specified a port number. In our case, we said 8787. That is the default that comes in inside this patch file. We can obviously change it, right? We can change it to whatever port is available on our machine. Some people may have this port being used by some other process, in which case obviously change this number to a number that works for your environment. But essentially, all I'm saying is that you can actually change this number, right? So when you start up your JBoss, you will see this kind of a blurb, right? This is standard, you will see this always. When you enable JPDA, you will see this line. And this is what tells you that now you are ready, or right now this JVM is ready to provide debugging information to an environment, as long as that environment knows how to attach to this JVM, right? And that's what we will talk about next, okay? So at this point, I have enabled my JPDA, I've started my app server, my JBoss server. Let me now go back. So like I was saying earlier, once you have done this, just make sure that you can see the JPDA enablement line in your console log, which we have seen already. So at this point, we are done with our setup on JBoss, right? The next step is to actually enable Eclipse, or rather set up Eclipse for the remote debugging over there, right? So to do that, we'll actually go to Eclipse and we will say, we'll go to Run and Debug menu item, right? So let's see, going to Run, this is my Eclipse, I'm going to Run, and I'm trying to open debug for settings, right? Over here in debug settings, if you search for, you can actually do a search for remote, and you will see this remote Java application. But for some reason, when I do that, it's giving me some trouble. So I'll just search, right? So if I search, if I scroll down, I'll do a search over here. I'll see this remote Java application, right? And then I can actually say new, and I'm essentially saying that, okay, I want to configure a remote Java application debugging session. That's what I'm basically saying over here. If I click on new, it basically opens up. It has a name over here and all of these settings, right? So let's understand what each of these means. So name, let's just give it a name that we can associate with our project. In my case, the project name is debug test, right? And I already have a setting for that, so I'm going to say debug test 2, right? That's the name of my setting. It'll automatically choose a project that's available in your workspace. You can obviously change it, right? You can change it to whatever project in your workspace your code is that you want to step through, right? You can also associate other sources outside of that project, right? So let's say there are some libraries that you are using, and you have source code for those libraries as well, and you'd like to step through that source code. You can obviously associate it over here in this section. You can say add, and then it gives you all the options to add whatever you like. You can actually add or external archive, an archive, a file system, even a Java project, right? So you could have another Java project that has the source code for that library that you're using. You can actually add it over here, right? So once you do that, this connection type, leave it as standard socket attach, right? There are two options over here. You will see attach and listen. Once you understand what attach does, which is what we will use in this case, you will probably inherently understand what listen does. Okay, now let's go to connection properties. In this uh, 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 section, we are specifying the host and the port, right? So host over here, in my case, my server is running locally, so I've said localhost, right? But this should give you some idea. This method of setting up your debugging environment is powerful. You could have your server running on a remote machine, right? Let's say you have a test environment and the bug is visible only in that test environment because of some data being available in the test environment or some other reason, right? It is not something that you have been able to recreate locally. In that case, you can actually enable debug mode using the JPDA process that I explained earlier on that remote server. And at that point, all you'll have to do is specify the remote host name over here, and this port number is the same port number that we had specified over there, which was 8787. If you remember, that was the port number that we had JPDA enabled for. This check mark is a nice to have, right? Basically what this will do is it'll allow you to terminate your JBOSS instance from inside Eclipse if you check this, right? So let's check this and let's see then what happens, right? So at this point, essentially that is it. I'm done with my setup, right? I can now click on apply and then click on close, and I'm done, right? My setup is done, right? So let's just quickly review the steps that we took, right? We went into Eclipse, we said run debug configurations, and then we said we need to configure a new remote Java application, debugging configuration, and then on the right we actually made a bunch of settings which I'm listing over here, right? So essentially we said that okay, create a new remote debug configuration, ensure the right project is selected, and change if needed, the type of a connection should be standard socket attach, which is the default. Just leave it as is. Enter the port number to attach to, in which case, in our case, it was 8787. You can associate to a remote host, like we said, right? And you can actually optionally choose the allow termination of remote VM, and in that case you will be able to kill the server from inside Eclipse, right? So that's essentially a review of the steps that we took, right? Now let's actually go ahead and have some fun, right? Let's actually start to debug. All right, so now we are at a place where we can actually debug, right? So the first thing that we have to do is we have to make sure that our server on which we will deploy our application is running, right? So in our case, we had started it, so it is actually running. We had also ensured that JPDA is enabled, so that is already in place, right? It's running, it's there, right? Step number 2, deploy your WAL file to the right JBOSS folder, right? So basically, obviously, if you have to debug the application on JBOSS, you have to deploy it on JBOSS, so make sure it is deployed. Deployment in a local setup is normally by just simply dropping the WAL file inside your JBOSS home standalone deployments folder. Let me just quickly show you where that folder is at, so you know. So basically this is my JBOSS home, and then I can go to standalone and then deployments, and this is where my debug test.wal, which is my WAL file that has the application that I want to debug. So it is already deployed, right? Now that we have our application deployed and we know everything is up, let's now switch to Eclipse and start the debug session using the setting that we had created, right? So let's go to Eclipse, right? In Eclipse, I'll go to Run. I'll go to and I'll show you the long way, and then I'll show you the short way. So debug test, and I will click on debug, right? So at this point, as you can see, I'm actually attached to the JVM, right? I can see the trace of the JVM over here. I am now actually in a debug session, right? This is my sample servlet. It's a very hello servlet, simple servlet. It is available at the hello endpoint, and the get method has been implemented doing something very, very simple. It actually prints out a statement on the console, and then it also prints back out in the browser hello from servlet, right? So it's a very simple servlet. Let's now invoke it, right? So I'm going to go to the browser and I'm now invoking my servlet, right? Let me just move this to the side a bit so that you guys can see what's happening. Okay, I'm refreshing and voila, right? I have my breakpoint and I'm actually now at the breakpoint, right? So if I see over here, I have now access to all of my debug information, right? I have my debug information available. I've essentially now able to debug and step through, right? So now everything is your normal debugging process. You can step over, you can step in, all that jazz, right? So all of that is there, right? And then since we had said that we do want to terminate, we do want to allow termination of a remote VM, I can actually click on this. And now if you see, let me show you, my server, which was running over here, has been killed, right? So that's it. Essentially, at this point, you have been able to successfully debug an application that was deployed on JBOSS from your Eclipse without any special plugins, right? So if you were just interested in that information, you are at this point golden. You're done, right? But I will have some additional follow-up information. So if you want to hang around and listen to that, please feel free to do so. All right, so let's just quickly review the steps we took to actually debug, right? So to enable debugging, first ensure server is up with JPDA enabled. Deploy your WAV file to the JBOSS folder. Ensure the application is actually deployed. There'll be some message on the JBOSS console that will indicate so. Now that we have done that, switch to Eclipse, start the debug session using what we had already created as part of step number 3 above. Put a breakpoint in your code that you want to debug. Use your browser or Postman to invoke the endpoint on the deployed application. And that's it. Enjoy, right? Have fun. All right. So now that we have done that, right, as developers, right, we always want to be, again, efficient, right? We want to reduce the number of clicks, right? We want to reduce the number of window switches that we have to do to get our development done, right? We are efficient creatures by nature. That's what we like to do, right? So here is a little bit of a follow-up, right? Some of you may have noticed that I had to go to a separate command prompt window to actually start my JBoss, right? Why do I have to do that? Can I actually start my JBoss also from inside my Eclipse, and that way I don't have to leave my environment, right? It's a very normal request. People would want to do that, right? So Eclipse is a very powerful and very flexible uh, development environment. And if you click around, right, every day, only for 5 minutes, you will learn so much information about how to use Eclipse more efficiently. It's just amazing, right? So you can use Eclipse to configure external tools to start pretty much anything on your machine, including JBoss in this case, right? So let's actually step through and see how to do that, right? So the first thing that we will do is we will actually go to the external tool menu item and get started there, right? So how do I do that, right? So I'll go to Eclipse, I'll go to Run, and then right at the bottom over here you will see external tools, right? So if I click on external tools, I have this option that says external tools configuration. So I click on this, right? And now it gives me a dialog box that I can use to set up my new external tool, right? If you see over here, there are few options. One of them is program. I'm going to use program, right? And if you see over here, I already have a setup to start my JBoss, but I'll create a new one over here. So I'll go back, click on program, click on new, and then I have my new configuration dialog box. I'll enter the name over here, enter something that will make sense to you. So I already have JBoss, so I'm going to say JBoss 2. And then over here, I have to essentially provide the command that I want to execute, the location of the command that I want to execute, right? You can type in the command. I'm going to browse, and I will say browse file system, and I will say go to my Eclipse home bin, and I want to execute standalone.sh, right? So I have it here, right? It'll also ask me the working directory in which this command should be executed, right? And again, while I think that we may not specify it, or we can leave it empty, or we can actually specify any directory, I still feel that we should actually specify the folder um, in which JBoss home, or rather JBoss home bin, and that way it is in the folder where it'll naturally should be started. So again, JBoss home bin open, right? So now that I have the location and the working directory, if you had a need to supply some arguments, right? Not in the case of this standalone.sh, but let's say you are creating some another external tool to be run from inside Eclipse, and you had to specify some arguments, you can do it over here. You can also specify some variables um, and all that jazz, right? So all of that is up to you to explore. But essentially at this point, essentially you're done. You can actually say show a command line. It's asking you to save. So I'm gonna apply, and then now it shows me the command line that it'll actually execute, which as you can see is the command line to start standalone.sh or my JBoss server, right? I can actually copy it and execute it from CLI just to confirm that this has been formed right? I don't need to do it, but I could if I wanted to, right? So let's close it now, and let's, let's run it. Okay, so run. And again, voila, Now my JBOSS has started inside my Eclipse. This is my console. Again, I can see that it is set up to listen to 8787. JPDA is enabled. That was the change we made in our standalone.conf. That is still effective, right? Everything looks hunky-dory at this point, right? Now let's actually, again, let's do a debug, right? So I showed you the long way. Go to Run Debug Configurations, right? I can actually go over here. It'll again show me a list of all the debug sessions I've done. I can just select, choose from here, debug test, right? As you can see, I'm in a debug session now. Same deal. Go to the browser, execute the endpoint. I'm here. My breakpoint has been hit. I can now step through the code, right? All right, and if I had to stop it, now I'm actually inside, right? So I can actually stop it right here. All right, you also created that standalone tool, so you can actually launch it from here and stop it from here, right? So let me relaunch it. I can launch it from here and I can stop it from here, right? So folks, that's it. That's it. Again, there are some very interesting ideas to be explored with external tools, right? You can do a lot of stuff. Maybe one of the homeworks that you could do is you could say that, okay, I still have to move my WAV file manually. I still have to do that, move it from my Eclipse environment to my JBoss. Maybe you could use an external tool to move it for you. Maybe you could actually, inside your Maven, if you're using Maven for your build like I am, use a Maven task to move it, right? Maybe you could actually write a small shell script, and that shell script is executed by your external tool, right? There are plenty of ways. There are plenty of ways to do that. Now that you have knowledge of these very, very basic tools, the world is open, right? And again, like I said, spend 5 minutes every day. You will learn something new about Eclipse. Eclipse is a very, very powerful tool, very, very flexible, and really very easy to poke around and learn on your own. Okay, thank you guys. That's it for today. Appreciate your time. Take care. Bye.